Alright, so I thought I'd put these two together for a sort of Never Leave the Fucking House Again double feature. And it seemed like this was at a time where I think Wrong Turn was 2003 and Wolf Creek was 2005, where we're kind of starting to get this turn in mainstream horror where things were getting a bit more brutal and relentless. Obviously, horror's been brutal and relentless for decades, but as far as it being in like movies that got like full-on theatrical releases and stuff like that, where 2003 is like when Saw came out, and it kind of feels like that sort of was a particular turning point. Not always into like the torture porn area, but in some cases, like in Wolf Creek, we'll talk about that. But just as far as in general, that sort of going more into just the brutality and the grittiness and the almost trying to make horror feel as real as possible. Something that at least goes back to, like, you know, The Last House on the Left and stuff like that, where it almost feels not quite documentary-like, but close enough to be really uncomfortable, and kind of adding that sort of scare factor to it. And it was that thing where we were getting into an area where there was the question of, as far as movies really laying into gore, and it's like, are gory movies scary or are they just gory? And it's like were movies starting to lose their scare factor around that time because of that, and just sort of making audiences turn away from the screen doesn't necessarily mean you're scaring them so much as you're, like, you know, grossing them out or just giving them a wholly unpleasant experience just because. Which is another thing that will kind of go more into the, I don't know if you want to call it the psychology of, that's probably too much, but we'll get into that with Wolf Creek especially, but if you want to start at Wrong Turn, where we're still kind of at this area where we're still within, like, the horror tropes, where we have stuff that's material we've kind of seen before, where we have the whole Mountain Man thing, which is something we saw in, like, Deliverance, and there's a couple of Deliverance references in it, of course, and it's set in West Virginia, because of course it is. And we get this whole opening sequence after we get, you know, two people who are rock climbing and just living their innocent lives until they're dramatically pulled into the woods and we hear maniacal laughter in the trees. We get this whole opening credit sequence that's talking about, like, you know, inbreeding and mutations and stuff like that, and basically setting up what our threat is going to be. What for a while feels like kind of an unseen threat. Like, they do this interesting thing where they kind of keep the grotesque faces of our three antagonists kind of obscured for a while and build some fear around that and sort of like this sort of unseen force in the woods. Almost like when you go into a place like the woods and you have this fear of something, but you can't quite put a face with it. It's almost like they kind of represent that in a way. But first we're going to meet our characters, because that's, you know, horror trope number one, starting with Desmond Harrington, who's probably the most distracted driver of all time. First, obviously we're in 2003, so his first distraction is going to be that his CD is skipping. And then ultimately he's going to be distracted by a deer and literally run into our main cast, who are Eliza Dushku, Jeremy Sisto, Emmanuel Shrieky, and Kevin Zegers and Lindy Booth. And many of these people won't last the first half of the movie, of course. And that's what I was talking about, where while we were in a particular place in horror where we were starting to go forward and get a little more brutal and more in the faces of audiences, Wrong Turn still had those elements lingering where it's, the horror tropes can be like a safety net to an audience, because obviously, like, a mainstream audience is going to go into a horror movie expecting to be, like, nervous and hopefully get scared at some point. But the fun thing about horror was always there was that safety net of it not being real and there being a screen between you. And all these things that you recognize, like the way the character types are very similar, the setups to when a character is probably going to die is very familiar. So it's like, even though you go in with that feeling of something's going to get you, there's still that feeling of, but I'm going to know it's coming, I'm going to know where it is and, you know, what all it is. And I know what to expect. But so, as far as, like, introducing the characters and those, we get stuff like Scott and Carly, the Sisto and Shrika characters, are like getting married, and they keep talking about that, and it's like the way they introduce all these things to these characters that we know they're not going to get far enough in life to actually happen. And that's just one of those cases where you're just counting down, like, yeah, I know this part and I know this stuff. I know these characters because these characters have been the characters in horror movies for however long. Um, and even when we reach like Zegers and Booth, the characters that are barely here, who exist basically just to be assholes. Like Zegers is the one that like really wants to be confrontational right away for no particular reason. Well, no, I guess he has some reason because he kind of destroyed the car, but he's much more hostile than the rest of the group, which it kind of sticks out in a way that means, oh, this guy will probably be the first to die. And naturally, because those horror tropes are a nice safety net for the audience, they're going to be right when they think that. And then we see, you know, like Lindy Booth going through his food and his CDs and just throwing stuff around. And it's like that's kind of the whole. You set the first set of people that are going to die. You set up to be the ones that nobody's really going to care when they die. It's brutal. That's a whole other psychology you can go into as far as audiences and how they view characters in horror movies and horror movies in general. But that's the way it's going to be. Where it may not be as scary if these people die compared to like maybe Scott and Carly later. The ones that the filmmakers attempt to attach us to. But that's the thing, is even though they're built up to be the assholes of the group, there is something that is harsher and more visceral than we were kind of initially used to, at least mainstream audiences were used to, at this time when we see them bring Lindy Booth's body in and they start to chop her up and eat her. And we see a lot more of this than audiences were probably expecting to at the time. So that setting itself up in kind of this turning point where we kind of start off with this place that we really know and that we're really familiar with, and now we're going down this path that's like, now we're not quite sure exactly how much we're going to see and how far it's going to go. And then that's when you can start feeling a bit uneasy. And they still kind of throw in these other things, like the whole, like seeing all the abandoned cars is a really eerie revelation once you realize what's going on. And they do find ways to be suspenseful, like when he's got Lindy Booth on the ground after she's dead and her blood flow is coming towards Desmond Harrington, and he has to try to not react while he's hiding under the table. It's something they build up nicely, like with minimal music and stuff like that. The door spring has always been like a really suspenseful moment, and that like it's almost like it's like that Mario Party game where you have to sneak out the door without waking up the thing on the chain. And it can be very, very nerve-wracking. Like if it's nerve-wracking in a Mario Party game, it's going to be nerve-wracking in a movie about cannibals, deformed cannibals at that. And we've got stuff like the idea of feeling trapped, where not only are you just trapped in the woods with these people, but like even when that lowers, when they're in the watchtower, a place that seemed like safety that suddenly becomes the death trap. And so it finds ways to do that. While this certainly is not one of the most acclaimed horror movies, it did eventually find like its fan base. I think it found its fan base even more after the sequels came out. But I remember this not being too huge at the time. It was being from here. I felt like it was talked about a lot, but I don't know beyond that how popular it was when it first came out. But I remember more and more people talking about it the longer it was out. But the thing about that is I'm a little surprised that it did find the fan base that it did, because I haven't really ventured into the sequels yet. Out of morbid curiosity, maybe I will. And then that, like, I think it's some sort of reboot they did that just came out like back in January or something. But talking about this movie just individually, it doesn't feel unique enough to really have much staying power, I would think. Because not only is it like deathly short, it's like an hour 20. There's gonna be, like I said, there's the Deliverance references. There's a lot of Texas Chainsaw in it, and it's just all so brief, and the characters are also recognizable in this way that's sort of generic. That as visceral as it is, there's really, I think the image that always stayed with me from when I first saw it was when Lindy Booth had the barbed wire in her mouth is pretty gruesome. And I said that just the whole idea in general of like when they have her on the table and the friends can just hear what's happening to her, and they just have to wait until the cannibals fall asleep. There is something harrowing to that, but like I said, we've seen not only did it not feel as unique when we had like stuff from the '70s that was as hardcore, but since then especially, if you would think it'd be even more watered down, and we've seen stuff that's even more like eventually like Hostel would find this kind of ground, and really take it to its absolute fullest that it could at the time. You would think that Wrong Turn would just kind of get left in the dust, but somehow it has managed to stay afloat through these direct-to-video sequels. But I don't know how much of that does come back to this one. But as far as like the impact that it made at the time, apparently it had a lot of trouble getting its R rating because of the gore, but also in an interesting sort of way, the TV spots they had a lot of trouble making. Because they were like, because the movie's so short and because it's all pretty much the intensity of it when it's not just the characters being whatever, you've got to be able to take something out of that and advertise it and let the audience know what they're getting. But there was like, they didn't really have the footage to do that, so the TV spots that they came up with were either rejected because they were too intense, or they were significantly cut down and really didn't show much of the movie at all, or give really, like, to the point that nobody really had any indication of what it was. And a lot of people kind of chalk that up to why it may not have been as successful. Like, it more than doubled its budget, but it was only like a $12 million budget, but so that's like, I think it was like $28 million or something it ended up getting. Which isn't a shitload, especially for a horror movie. But it was like, it took the, like, DVD and the sequels to eventually find its life, but even then, like I said, I don't really know what it is that stands out, because we do have some things here. I guess we can talk about the Mountain Men themselves, where we do have the Stan Winston designs, and it's easy to dismiss that he might not have had a lot to do with it based on the opening credit where it just kind of says that it's his company, but there's actual like pictures of him on the set, and I guess he was like really involved in the design of these three. And it's who are they? It's Three Finger, Sawtooth, and One Eye. And yeah, there is something to them, and I like the fact that, like I said, they're kind of, we don't get really great looks at them until really late. They're kind of built up, and we just kind of see the backs of their heads for a while. So there is something to that, and there is a scary factor to that they build up quite nicely that a lesser horror movie would have just been quick to shove into our faces. But that's about as far as I can really think as far as like any sort of originality it might have. As far as like the characters go, we do get some real moments, like the way Carly reacts after Scott is killed, where it's like, usually in horror movies it's like you don't really have time to mourn, but we actually get these moments where Carly is like seemingly dead inside, and there's the point where they set the bear trap off and she's just sort of laughing maniacally like they are. And I feel like it would have been interesting and nice to see the character lose her mind a little more, but she kind of literally loses her mind right after this when her head gets cut in half. But I feel like that could have been maybe a road to go down, and something that could have added, like there was enough to where they could have added a little more runtime to it. And I would have kind of liked to have seen Carly kind of lose her mind gradually more and more as it went on. But we had to get to the gore, so we had to, cut her head off pretty much immediately as they established that she might be losing it a little bit. Basically just leaving us with our heroes, who are Desmond Harrington and Eliza Dushku. And Eliza Dushku, who for some undiscernible reason is named after the main character in Gerald's Game. I don't know, first and last name. I don't really know what the callback is there. I was waiting, like, you wait for something to happen to her hand, but no, it's just the name, I guess. And we do get into a little something about her guilt, where we have that point. That's another point. One of those things you can count on in a horror movie is we're going to eventually get to a stopping point so that the characters can character for a second. And while it does seem like we're kind of getting to that sort of, same old thing, where it doesn't really matter anyway, they do add a little layer here where Jessie does have guilt, where this whole trip was for her benefit, and now she's going to be like the sole survivor of the initial group. And there is something there, but once again, much like with Carly potentially losing her mind, they kind of set something up that could be interesting that we could see more of, but it's just kind of more like, let's just keep it about, the gore and the chasing and the stuff like that. Which in another movie I would commend, but when you actually have these, like when you actually get the moment where you can establish these openings that could go farther, is when it's like, yeah, you could have probably expanded on that, but that also kind of cuts down on like the gore aspect also, because it kind of feels like it's when it feels like that's all they really were devoted to, as far as the filmmakers go. It can kind of take away the quality, even if some of the scare factor might still be there or the gore factor is there. It still feels like there's something missing at the end, and it does feel kind of too short at the end of the day, which I suppose with a movie that could be considered this unpleasant, it'd be hard to say that, we needed more of it. But like I said, as far as building character go, that could have actually maybe added a little more of a grounded factor to it, something that we see in Wolf Creek, that'll add another sort of scary element to it, or another scary layer to it. But as is, it's just kind of another horror movie, and it ends exactly the way you expect it to, where they appear dead, and then the credits happen, and a few credits happen, and then, oh no, they're actually not, or at least one of them's not. So, yeah, maybe one of these days I will explore and see what all the sequels have going on, but I'm not very optimistic, but we'll see. I don't know really what else you could add to this that would be too much worth, but I have underestimated some things before, so we'll see what happens. We're still in the middle of the Tremors thing now, so I guess never say never to that kind of thing, but we'll see. But now, talking about how this was still in that sort of safe horror realm, where audiences had the safety net of knowing what was going to happen and knowing we'd eventually reach these certain points, and then we'd reach the ending that we know is going to happen. Wolf Creek, on the surface, probably seems like that. Where it seems like, we set up characters, and then those characters meet a stranger, and then bad things happen, and then the movie ends. One of them gets away. But, yeah, we're kind of we were talking about how that progression we were headed towards, where we had just sort of started with delving into that territory of being much darker and bleaker for mainstream audiences. Yeah, I can't imagine if Wolf Creek came out pre-Saw. I can't imagine Wolf Creek getting the wide release that it did. It was at our theater in this town. I can't imagine us having this movie like 2003 or so. But now that we were in that territory and Saw movies were coming out and everybody wanted this kind of thing, Wolf Creek got the full layout. And I remember the reactions to it being particularly... Most people were just very upset by it. And when you see it, it's one of those cases of... I would never, ever fault anybody for being absolutely repulsed by Wolf Creek and like never wanting to lay eyes on it again, and being angry that it exists at all. I'm not going to fault anybody for that. But I can also see where it's commendable, the commitment you have to make a movie like this in the direction you're going to take it. I kind of praised Hostel for the same thing, where the approach of that bleakness could be something that was sort of weirdly... I mean, fresh is like the last word you want to use with the experience that Wolf Creek gives you. But that idea of the relentlessness of horror and just how far it can go as far as feeling real. Like one of the comments on the cover... Two of the comments on the cover are Tarantino and Rodriguez. And while Tarantino praised John Jarrett, Rodriguez said, "As real as horror gets." And then on the back, somebody said, "Not since the original Texas Chainsaw has terror felt so real." So that was basically the whole thing going into Wolf Creek was. It was going to try to make the experience as real as possible. Like I said, almost where it's like... Almost like it's found footage without being found footage. But thank Christ it wasn't. But I was saying, sort of in that like Last House on the Left kind of vibe. The original Cravens. So here... we do have the setup that might be kind of cheap as far as setting it up as a real thing. Because it does give us the screen that says based on actual events, and it says it's in 1999, and gives us missing person statistics and stuff like that. And yeah, while it is I think it's based on like at least a couple of like real killers or real incidents, um, which may or may not could be seen maybe in poor taste. That's another thing a criticism that I probably wouldn't argue with, even if I think the movie reaches its goal as far as feeling as real as possible and taking the audience to a real place. Because what I was talking about with stuff like Wrong Turn was when the audience knows what's coming and they know they're getting the horror tropes. That's where a lot of people have fun with horror. Like that, like a lot of people think that horror is too gruesome and they wonder why anybody goes to it. The people that do go to horror movies that love them typically have fun at them. Like there's something like the fact that we get all wrapped up in horror around this time when we talk about all these different movies and all the different directions horror's gone, all the different ways you can do horror. There's something incredibly fun about the horror genre, and the way it's able to sustain itself and keep going and come up with either new ideas or take old ideas and somehow keep life in them, and they just keep on going. Like I said, something as simple as the slasher genre could go on forever, and somehow never lose its impact as long as it's well made. And Wolf Creek has taken us into a territory to where horror can also not be fun, where it's like there's typically the fear and then the release, and then Wolf Creek is setting up the idea of the fear that doesn't have a release, like the real fear in real life would be if you were in this scenario. So something that's going to have to really work in order for this whole concept to go through is to make the characters feel real. And I think the way they accomplish this is, first off, just the fact in general that it sets itself up like a road trip movie. Where it's like you could probably watch this movie for a good 45 minutes and forget that you're watching a horror movie. Because it's basically like a gender reversed E2 Mama Tombi end for a while. And then as it goes on, the biggest threat is they run into some friendly faces like Graham, the attendant, but then they run into some not so friendly faces, the guys at the bar. Just what you genuinely would, especially if you're like, a tourist or whatever. Or you're a dude with two attractive women with you and you've got these, weird horny dudes at the bar. Naturally, you might have an antagonizing situation on your hands at some point. But nothing completely, nothing that feels out of a horror movie, certainly. Just maybe a few douchebags along the way. And then as it goes on, we get the really nice landscape shots, and it basically feels like some sort of vacation movie. And then we get to a point where they'll have conversations, but it's like the way they talk like real people, where it's like they'll bring up philosophical questions or something, but it's never too deep. It never feels written. It just kind of feels like people just the way people would just talk to each other. Especially these three people that seem to not completely and totally know each other really well, but fairly well. They're not people that have known each other forever, but they're friendly up to this point to where they know each other enough to where they can sustain just random bullshit conversation without feeling awkward. And so that's there. And then eventually when the horror does start to creep in a little bit, there's this, they've been talking about UFOs and aliens, and there's the possibility of that. And I would love the idea, I'd love to see this movie from the perspective of somebody that didn't know what it was going in. Just to see if at first they didn't realize, I mean there's the missing person stuff at the beginning, but if they forget that it's going to be a horror movie, and if they think it's going to be an alien movie, and if they trust Mick or not when they first see him, or if he's immediately threatening to people that don't know. Because, as we talked about with Tarantino praising John Jarratt, who he eventually put in Django, John Jarratt's also the one that taught Tarantino his Australian accent for Django, so anybody that bitched about that can take it up with him. But the thing here that's very interesting that sets this up is the way Jarratt plays Mick at first, where he has to be just seeming like the friendliest guy ever. And what's great about this is you can get so caught up in his charm that even if you've seen the movie before, you might still buy into it. And it's the way he really has that effortless friendliness to him. And the only time we kind of start to see the facade drop is when he makes the Crocodile Dundee reference, and he's clearly offended by it. But even then, it's sort of it comes back around, and we kind of still, the charm comes back around. And then eventually it gets to the point where we know where this is going to go. And what's interesting about this also is we were talking about Texas Chainsaw comparisons with Wrong Turn, and it's like also talking about Texas Chainsaw as far as Wolf Creek goes, is they're both kind of in that category of it's the movie that can make you afraid of seeking help. Like usually, like that's the one. Like when you're in a horror situation, your first instinct and any character's first instinct will be to seek out help. But then it's like it gets to the point where if you've seen enough movies like Wolf Creek, even that idea seems terrifying now, and makes you feel very isolated. Let alone being in an area like this where Wolf Creek is set, in this middle of nowhere Australia where there is just literally nothing. But at the same time, um, it's still like when the sun goes down and we still don't know that Nick is a threat yet. Like even at night, the landscapes still like have this, it's this beautiful place at night, but at the same time, the way it's shot also and how we get lower and lower until it's like just headlights. It feels like the characters are kind of dropping down into a hole that they're getting deeper and deeper into the more they follow Mick. And then that will be about the time that the horror starts setting in. And that's the thing is when we finally realize what's going on here and it really sets in and becomes a horror movie, it's probably close to an hour in, or about an hour in. So Wolf Creek becomes a horror movie about the time Wrong Turn is almost over. Which is commendable because they've set it up this much and they've made everything feel real enough that when the horror does come, and the horror is so visceral by itself, the horror would be, terrifying by itself. If it had been introduced like half an hour in, it still would have been a pretty harrowing experience. But because of all this build-up, and because the characters feel so real at this point and so lived in, it feels much more relentless and much more like it makes you feel trapped as an audience. Because it is one of those cases where it seems like, but with there being two of them and one of him, you would think that there would be a lot of cases where it's like, can't one just attack him or can't one just do this or something, like he's just one dude. But that whole idea of feeling like within that fear of just making a move might get you killed, and that whole idea of seeing all the different scenarios of what could happen and his whole sort of arsenal that he's got here. And all the bodies on the wall. That one girl in particular on the wall that he singles out and says she was up there for months. It gets terrifying very, very quickly. But that whole idea of basically feeling figuratively paralyzed when it's like you could make a move, but is that going to be your last move or not? And you can sense the characters just kind of being frozen in fear in place, trying to decide if they should make a move or not, which is just in the most twisted way possible, brought to life, literally, when she does end up paralyzed when he severs her spine and dubs her a head on a stick, which is one of these cases where you could think maybe it's going overboard. Like I said, the way it really has built itself up and the way it sort of almost earned the right to literally paralyze the audience with fear, in this way that's completely and totally inescapable. Like I said, you'd almost wonder what's even the point of it. But like I said, there's so many different facets to horror, and different ways you can explore it. And it's like, this is really just another one of those paths, where it's like, where we don't have the scenario of something contrived happens, and the hero is able to find a way out, and in some way they're able to take him, like, taking him down is one of the first things they do when she shoots him in the neck. It just doesn't work, is the problem. And that whole idea of, like, even when the sun comes up, where it's like, in a horror movie, the worst thing is that it's at night, and everything bad happens at night. And then when the sun comes up is usually when the credits are about to roll. But the danger is just continuing because we're still stranded. Like, it doesn't matter if it's night or day, we are still completely stranded out in the middle of nowhere with no way to get around. And anybody that comes to help, can easily be taken out because of Mick's rifle. Because like the knife felt intimidating enough when we were really up close to it, but now when we're far away from him, we still have to fear him because he always has the appropriate weapon for the appropriate situation, and can take out anybody at any given time. And I think there's also something to there's something very grindhouse about this movie, which you can see. I feel like it makes sense that Tarantino and Rodriguez uh, are quoted on the cover. But that's the thing, is taking this approach to this different kind of horror where nobody comes out, and we've seen that before, where eventually nobody comes out and nobody gets away at the last minute. But like I said, it's the relentless nature of this, especially when we get the footage at the end that tries to play up the real aspect again about how, there was a whole trial and how it was no trace of them was ever found, and then that just last shot of him just walking off into the abyss to continue this, which would be significantly scarier if we didn't have a dreadfully shitty sequel in like 2013, I think. That was just the fucking worst. And that's the case. Is you could say this movie is like humorless and too bleak. They did try to throw dark humor into the sequel, and it just didn't work. It felt way too desperate and stupid, it was just a complete disaster. And apparently, a third one is in production or like in the works or something. But I don't know. This one really stands alone by itself, and I think it'd be scarier if it stood alone by itself too. But you know how horror movies work. It just comes with the territory, unfortunately. But yeah, so I'm one of those people that, maybe some of us are just sick or something, but can really appreciate the different ways of looking at horror and how you can take, the tropes and do something, really dark and bleak with them, but still end in the same area of getting out and stuff like that, but still leaving a cliffhanger or something like that, but then just taking everything and just killing all hope. There's so much to do with horror. There's a place for everything. And this is a really, really well executed version of that idea of the just total bleakness, just making it as real as possible. Where these are the it makes sense that this is kind of told in the frame of some true story that's not completely true. Of the whole idea of the real people like Mick being out there that just sort of get away, and there are people that we just never hear from again. And these horrible crimes that are like never solved. And yeah, there is a way to do that, and this is pretty much the way, I would think. Like I said, it may seem like a lot, but it might. This is the kind of territory in horror that clearly wouldn't be for everybody, and that makes perfect sense. Like, there's nothing wrong at all with the people that wouldn't take to something like Wolf Creek. If anything, they're the ones that are more, the sane of us, I guess. But artistically, I really think there's something here. Even if it might just seem like it's in that torture porn area and there's not really much point to it. Just the portrayal of the helplessness and the fear. Like the fact that none of this is actually happening in the movie and these are all actors is what makes the movie so impressive. It's like Cannibal Holocaust all over again. And it's like when you see that the actresses do the commentary on the DVD, it's like, oh, thank God, they're still alive. It helps a lot when it's people that you don't see like in other movies or like in other popular things at least. That it's almost like they can just sort of disappear in this very real way. But yeah, so like I said, as far as what these accomplished with what they were going for, obviously I think Wolf Creek significantly accomplished what it was doing. Wrong Turn is, fun in a guilty pleasure kind of way, but I still don't think it really adds much to the genre or brings anything new to what it's doing. Apart from maybe, some of the really wicked designs of the Mountain Men, but that's about all it really has to offer, I think. With some suspenseful moments here and there, and like I said, if it could have expanded on the characters a little more, it might have had a bit more impact, but as is, it's just another horror movie to me. But that doesn't have the staying power that something like Wolf Creek does. So there's that. So I guess that's going to do it for these. The next one, we might be going into Del Toro territory. There might be one before that. I don't remember. No, there is one in between that. But we will be getting to Del Toro very soon as well. We're going to be going into Seeing the Future in the next one. And then we'll be talking about stuff like, the new releases and the Scenes from a Marriage miniseries and all that stuff. A couple more trilogies, and a bunch of other stuff. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.